Hi, I'm Bernard Leong, and you may know me as the executive who's always curious about how government agencies deal with trade in Southeast Asia. And in my spare time, I want to know what the Australian Trade and Investment Commission is doing in the region of Southeast Asia. You're listening to Analyse Asia, a podcast dedicated to dissect the pulse of business, technology, and media in Asia. And today, I have Taliessin Reaburn, Trade Commissioner to Singapore with Australia Trade and Investment Commission. Welcome to the podcast. How are you doing?
Hi Bernard, great to be here today, and thank you very much for taking the time to do this interview.
Thank you for also hosting me in the Australia High Commission in Singapore today. I think we're going to have a pretty interesting conversation about the Landing Pad initiative and how Australia has been helping Australia companies coming into Southeast Asia. But before that, I would like my audience to get to know you better. How did you start your career?
Hello to everyone today. I guess really my career started when I finished high school. I went straight into employment and started working in the insurance sector. This is going back a little way before email, before the internet, for those of you out there who can remember that. And one of my first jobs, I think I was 17 at the time, one of my first jobs was actually sending checks to clients and customers. And every check we had to put in an envelope manually before automated payments and things like that. And I realised, I think, that business and all business relies on a lot of very small transactions, and some of those are putting checks in envelopes. But then, look, from there, I went on when I was older, went back to university, studied and had a range of roles. Again, I worked in the financial services sector, but also in higher education, mainly in quality assurance and risk assessment, and then started working with government sort of, mid-career, and did international trade, export development and industry policy, and then been working with Austrade now for about 8 years in a variety of roles.
And you travel across the world?
Most of my travel, particularly, with Austrade, like I said, I've been with Austrade 8 years. I worked for a while on project work in Malaysia. After that, I spent a couple of years up in Hong Kong, where I got to do work both in the Hong Kong market and the mainland China market as well. I've been here in Singapore about 2.5 years. And in that time, I've been able to do work in Indonesia, Philippines, Malaysia, a little bit in Thailand and Vietnam, and been to Myanmar for a couple of projects as well, but predominantly focused on the Singapore market.
And of course, the reason why you're here is that you can also share about some of your experience, given that you have been to many countries from China all the way to Myanmar. So probably just very curious to ask, what are the interesting life lessons you can share with my audience?
Wow. I mean, life lessons, and from a professional point of view, the life lessons are that business happens everywhere. Networks are really important, but often you don't know who are the most important part of those networks. You always have your key clients, but you should never neglect those clients that you don't yet know where the element of success will be. So be open to meeting as many people as possible, and make sure those networks are healthy and broad, because you don't know how you'll be able to connect people into the future. On a personal level, resilience, you have a lot of challenges. Never give up. Keep pushing ahead for whatever it is you're trying to achieve. Particularly in business, you need a lot of resilience. And there's always someone out there who will be able to connect you to the next person and the next right person for you. So just keep pushing on whenever you have those challenges.
And we come to the main subject of the day. We want to talk about what is Austrade doing with the Landing Pad and its entrance into Southeast Asia. This is the first time I actually have a trade commissioner on my show, so it's actually very interesting to know how different countries can come into Asia together, particularly for small and medium businesses. As a start, maybe I would like to understand Austrade better. Can you describe the mission and vision for the Australia Trade and Investment Commission and how it operates as a government agency?
We have quite a narrow focus. So Austrade, the Australian Trade and Investment Commission, shortened to Austrade, which is a bit easier to say. Really, our task is to increase trade from Australia to other markets. So in particular, my area is in Singapore. So increasing trade between Australian companies and Singapore, and also increasing investment between Singapore and Australia. So we work with Australian companies who are trying to expand their operations and expand the markets that they export to, and grow their share into Singapore. And from there, obviously, we all know Singapore is a great hub for the region, has connectivity throughout Southeast Asia and the world, whether that be through its transport connections or its financial markets connections. So we also use that Singapore as a bit of a jump-off point into other parts of the region and other markets. And we also know that Singapore as a global financial capital centre, does a lot of work around investment. So there's a lot of capital flows through Singapore into Australia, into major infrastructure and major investment opportunities there too.
So what is your current role and coverage as the Trade Commissioner to Singapore with Austrade then?
As a Trade Commissioner, I look after different priority sectors for us. Here in Singapore, I look after our food and beverage sector, which includes traditional food exports into Singapore, but also now increasingly includes work in the ag tech and food tech space, and that includes investment work into Australia as well as bringing up new food and ag technologies into Singapore. I look after our health and medtech space, and again, medtech is a growing area of export. We've got quite a deep capability in Australia, and we're bringing up more companies. Last year we brought up a medtech delegation to Singapore, and we've just taken a couple of Singapore companies down to Australia for a large event in Melbourne. I also look after our construction and smart cities space. Again, we've got a lot of Australian companies working here in Singapore and the region via Singapore in the sort of built environment space, and a lot of work going on there. Also, I look after education, and we have Singapore is Australia's number one partner for delivery of higher education courses. So we have about 20 Australian universities delivering programs in Singapore, and we have a lot of partnerships both in education but also in R&D through our universities, and doing a lot of work around that space. And then I also look after our landing pad program, which is a relatively new program. It's been going for about 2 years up here in Singapore and globally, and we'll talk about that in more detail, I'm sure.
How does Austrade help businesses in Australia come to Asia? I mean, you have alluded to the fact that they come here, they might most likely their first touch point is through you, but how do you set them up, for example, maybe visit to companies, for example, facilitation of management or strategic partnerships?
I mean, this is a great question, and this is really our core work, and our core mission is to help individual companies. We have a team here in Singapore of about 15 staff who look after the different priority sectors that I mentioned, and a few others as well. And they have broad networks here in Singapore, and networks that understand the market opportunity here and also understand who the key players are. So when we have an Australian company, and just in the last couple of weeks I've had a couple come to me, the first thing we do is we tell them about the Singapore market. We give them information on what are the trends here, what are the business conditions, what's the operating environment like, how competitive it is. We talk to them about their product as well. And sometimes that's a very clear product, sometimes it's a more broader service. But we talk about how they see it entering the market. We give broad advice. We may also connect them to other agencies and specialists within Singapore who can provide additional advice. Sometimes that may be around regulatory conditions or special licenses that they may need to operate. A good example is in the financial services space. Obviously, we do a lot of work with MAS, and we may connect them into that type of agency to get sort of regulatory advice. When they actually want to come into the market, we connect them to individuals and individual organisations who may be able to give them an opportunity, as in an actual commercial outcome for them. Sometimes, and Singapore's a highly competitive market, it's globally exposed, so you've got to be top of your game when you're in Singapore. So we try to make sure that when Australian companies come up here, their selling messages are very precise, their points of differentiation are clear, and that they come in with a clear strategy to engage with Singaporean organisations to get that first win under their belt.
Just to help my audience, MAS means the Monetary Authority of Singapore, and is part of doing the regulation. Then if you are very interested in things like blockchain, tech this time, they are probably the people that you would definitely interface with. I understand that Austrade now have a program called the Landing Pad, which is how this conversation came about. The vision is to create a platform for local enterprises to collaborate with Australian startups and help them find success in the region. And by region, we will mean the Southeast Asia. That would include the Association of Southeast Asian Nations, which some people call it ASEAN. So can you describe the Landing Pad more from a global scale point of view, and specifically drill down to Singapore and what is the mandate of the Landing Pad?
Yeah, thanks, Bernard. I think if we go back a little bit, and I think all your listeners would agree that business is changing. These startups that are now a really important part of the sort of broader economy, and how they innovate and how they accelerate innovation, particularly related to technology, new sort of technological advances, and how companies can take that up. This is happening everywhere, and it's happening in Australia, and it's happening to a lot of our businesses. So Austrade, we've seen around the world that we're getting new types of businesses wanting our services. And so we wanted to help design a program that's going to be able to specifically help these types of business accelerate their growth internationally. And traditionally our services are mainly for well-established businesses who have an export strategy, who are very clear on their products. What we're finding in the tech space and the innovation space is that these companies are much more agile, they pivot rapidly, they can move into a market and out of a market and make decisions in a matter of months. They have different funding models and different, revenue models as well. So we needed to upskill ourselves, and design a program that actually can increase the success of these businesses. So back in Australia, we had a national, agenda around our national innovation and science agenda, of which this landing pads program is part. And this is a national strategy for all of Australia, but it includes an international component. And so in recognition of these changing businesses and the opportunity around innovation and technology, the landing pads program was established in 5 places around the world: Shanghai, San Francisco, Berlin, Tel Aviv and Singapore. I'm a little bit biased, but I think the Singapore one has been the most successful. We love seeing more innovative companies come up here. But it's been established for, I think, in total, the program started about 2.5 years ago. We established here in Singapore just over 2 years ago. We've had 8 cohorts of companies come through. And just talking about the Singapore program in a little bit more detail, it is a landing pad. It's like an incubator program, although more for sort of scale-ups rather than early-stage startups. So what we do is we take Australian companies that are innovating and that have a strategy to go global, and they have a product which, is assessed as being ready to go global. We bring them up to Singapore for a 90-day program. So we actually have a physical location for our landing pad, and that's in the city at Just Co at the moment. They're provided with a physical location, a desk, so they can come in, they have a place where they can sit down and continue to work. We give them access to a landing pad manager, which is a dedicated resource to help them over those 90 days craft their business strategy and enter the market. And over 90 days, we try to accelerate their growth, to make them successful. And so far, out of the 38 companies that have gone through, we're having some really, really good success. We've raised, I think, more than 24 million in capital, for the companies. We've had nearly half of them establish offices here in Singapore and hire additional staff here in Singapore. We've had many companies go out into the region: Vietnam, Malaysia, Indonesia, Philippines. I think one has already gone up to India as well. And we've probably signed, I think the number we use is about 50 agreements, so a lot of enterprise partners, a couple of Singaporean government agencies as well that we're doing either pilots or partnerships with through our companies. And we're also connecting them into the Australian traditional business sector as well, and into the Singaporean ecosystem. So we're seeing momentum building and other wins coming through the landing pad program as well.
Interesting, because I think when it comes to Australia, the most prominent tech companies I would think of would be Taliessin and 99 Designs. And recently there's a company called Canvas which raised a lot of money from Sequoia Capital. And in my domain in drone delivery, there's a company called Nova Systems. They're actually working with our Civil Aviation Authority of Singapore. I'm very curious to know what success really means for the landing pad all over the world.
Traditionally, with these innovative companies, success is about the bottom line, and their growth. And, we all talk about unicorns and great, Atlassian and Canva, really fantastic. And Singapore's got, the unicorns as well. Everyone loves to talk about those big successes. The landing pad, though, is a program, So while it's fantastic to see our companies that come through the landing pad program do well financially and go to their next capital raise and be successful, for us, what we're trying to do is we're trying to reposition, the innovation ecosystem of Australia, make it more global. So that's the first thing. The research back in Australia shows that those startups that start with a global mentality are more successful than those that don't. So one, we want to give them a channel to go global earlier in their development, right? So that helps the ecosystem as a whole. The second thing we want to do is we want to raise the profile of Australian innovation. Every country is innovating, and I think in Australia we've got some unique solutions to some problems, and we want to accelerate them, make them more successful, but also share that technology and those solutions. Increasingly, the problems that business face are not just local, they're international, whether that be around production efficiencies, whether it be around multiple market access points, whether it be around technologies that accelerate the efficiency in the use of different materials, and here we're talking about sustainability. These are issues every business faces. So if we've got technology that can address some of those, we want that to be shared more broadly. And we also want to build greater platform between Australia and Singapore for all companies to move back and forth in innovation. They're the different types of successes. But in saying that, we also love to see our individual companies do well, and that's always, makes you very satisfied.
Since the launch of the landing pad in Singapore, I think at least 2 years, what are the number of startups that come here, and what industry verticals are they typically in? Can you share about 2 or 3 startups that can within landing pad in Singapore?
Yeah. We've had, as I mentioned, we've had 8 cohorts come through our program, so we're up to 38 companies. I'm just trying to think which would be the best ones to talk about. From an industry vertical, we're agnostic. We open to any company that we think meets our criteria and will be successful in the market and is committed to the market. However, we've probably seen two or three areas that we get a consistent high percentage of companies come through. One is around sort of logistics tech, and in Australia, logistics is a big sector. We're a very large company. The movement of goods and services across Australia geographically presents a lot of challenges, so we've got a lot of efficiencies in that space. A couple, CEC Systems, which does collapsible containers for the shipping industry, has done incredibly well and gone on to set up here in Singapore and also has operations in Vietnam, so they've done very well. Matchbox Exchange, yet again providing a technology platform for mapping and monitoring the movement of shipping containers so that they never physically idle. At the moment, a lot of shipping services leave containers between jobs sitting in a yard for a long period of time. And what this does, it creates efficiencies within that sort of system. We've got quite a few logistics companies using different platforms, using AI, bringing in new technology solutions for efficiencies in that sector. The other one I think we get quite a few companies is in the medical space. So medtech and health tech, cloud-based systems for diagnostics and imagery. Z Technologies, they're one of our early cohorts. They've done well and established up here, branching out into the rest of the region, doing incredibly well. Anatomics, which does 3D printing, sort of for medical purposes, of bones, of parts of the body. And they've been highly successful globally in a very niche area, so very specialised, and have been involved in a couple of very high-profile medical cases where they've actually been involved in saving lives that might not have been able to be saved without that technology. And they've established here in Singapore as well and gone on to great success. So there are a couple of areas that we have concentrations of companies coming through.
I also understand the Landing Pad program has also aligned with Singapore's push in cybersecurity as part of Singapore's Smart Nation program. Can you talk about how did that work?
We've got a concentration of cyber companies on our current cohort with, I think, 50% of the companies in the cyber space. And we all know globally, cybersecurity is really important. Every company, it impacts across every vertical, every part of industry. Data is now key in the success of businesses, and which means cyber is very close behind that. So this group have come up with support from AusCyber, which back in Australia is Cyber Sector Industry Group, which is supported by the government, and they've put a priority on engaging into this part of the region. Last year, we worked with AusCyber to bring up a delegation of companies, and that was highly successful. And so we talked with them, and they said, let's see if we can get a concentration of cyber companies onto the landing pad cohort, and we have that now. We're already doing quite a bit of work with them, with organisations here in Singapore. Obviously, CSA is the big cybersecurity authority here in Singapore. Also ICE 71, which is Singapore's cyber incubator program. So we're doing some work with them as well. And we think this is an area clearly where the problems, they're global issues, and if we can work together to solve some of them, or at least create better outcomes for companies, then it's a win-win for everyone involved.
I want to change the conversation a lot more on looking at the region as a whole. The Southeast Asia, or some of us call ASEAN as a whole, is a very different set of nations together. There are developed markets like Singapore, there have emerging markets like Indonesia, Thailand, and then there are frontier markets like Myanmar. From your perspective, how do you look at these markets, and how do you help companies to think about expanding into these countries when it comes to Southeast Asia?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think when you're looking at innovation and the program through the landing pad, sometimes those terms around developed and frontier and established sort of don't really make sense, because we're getting, cohorts and concentrations of capability in different markets around the world. But if we talk about Southeast Asia, where companies are being incredibly successful, when traditionally you might have described parts of their business economy as still developing or frontier. But so we really look at the opportunities and try to engage companies with the opportunities, as opposed to looking at the broader sort of, what you might call an economic definition of, of economies in the region. We've got unicorns coming out of Indonesia. We've got massive momentum building in markets like Manila and, the Vietnam as well. Luckily for us, Austrade being a government agency, we have offices in all these markets. So I think we have 10 offices across Southeast Asia, Singapore, Indonesia, Malaysia, Vietnam, Thailand, Philippines. We have teams there that are out working in the economy with business, looking at these trends. So the first thing we do when we bring our startups and scale-ups into Singapore as part of the landing pad program, we sit down and we do a market briefing on the markets across the region. That's the first thing we do. We've got some little reports that we've put together that we share with them around what we see, some of the key trends, some of the hotspots. We provide this information to them. The rationale, some of the companies that we have that come up from Australia already have a strategy. They recognise that Singapore is incredibly important as a market. But I mean, we all know Singapore is small from a consumer point of view. If they want to look at secondary markets in the region, we will already help them with that. We'll plan a visit to those markets with our offices in those markets. For other companies that are coming up and they really are just looking to establish in Singapore before looking at secondary markets, we provide a much broader brushstroke around the trends, where we see the opportunities, who some key decision makers in the markets might be. We're also, our offices across the region are also working with, incubators, with government programs in those markets to establish partnerships where we can physically place companies, on a short-term hot desking arrangement. If they come up to Malaysia, they can go and sit in the magic incubator down there, for either a couple of days or a period of time. So we're forming those sort of partnerships as well, and that's through our traditional Austrade offices.
So I think from a government agency's perspective, then how do you help these startups to set up for their market entry into the region? I guess my question is a little bit deeper in the sense that what do you look out for from the government's perspective and also from the company's perspective? Because I think there may be conflict as well. Between government relations is very important as well.
Yeah, we don't really see much conflict. I mean, we're very lucky. Like I said, we're an agency that's focused very much on supporting business. That's our mandate, and supporting those businesses that want to expand into the region. So while the landing pad program itself, we have a panel back in Australia, an independent panel that startups and scale-ups have to apply through to get onto the landing pad program. Right? So that's an independent process. Once they're on the landing pad program and they come up, we will work with them to meet their goals on that 90-day program. Now, we do a bit of a pre-work with them. So before they actually come up to Singapore, we'll sit down with them. We'll have video conferences with them. We'll work with them on their goal setting. As with many companies, and I'm sure your listeners see this all the time, especially with the startups, they're very aggressive. They have a wide range of goals. Our task at that early stage is really to narrow down their goals, to say, you've only got 90 days. What are the number one things you want to achieve? Some of that is enterprise partners, some of that is capital raising. If it is expansion into a secondary market, Indonesia, Malaysia, Thailand, etc., well then we will work early, so even before they get up here, to make sure they're connected to our teams there, that they understand the trends and that the goals they're setting for those markets align with what our people on the ground are seeing. So those discussions happen very early. As a government agency, the businesses, they have commercial outcomes that they want to achieve. Our job is to help them achieve them. I don't think, certainly in the landing pad program to date, there haven't been any conflicts around that. I think occasionally there's been some companies with, goals that are probably too big for what we can achieve in that time period. But that's a challenge, for all of us, for them, for us, and for the market as well.
I thought maybe sometimes if you go enter into a country and then you might require a certain license to operate. I think there's some of the thoughts that came out from the question itself. But I want to ask this last question. What are the key challenges for startups typically entering into Southeast Asia?
The biggest challenge, I think, is that they've got to be ready. And I think a lot of companies, and this is not just from the landing pad, we have a lot of other Australian startups coming through Singapore. And under the broad landing pad program, we've been working with a whole variety of incubators in Australia to bring up for, sort of boot camp style. They come up for a week and meet people and things like that. And that's a brilliant intro to the market before you might come up for a 90-day program. Increasingly, we're also working with Singaporean incubators to do a similar thing back in Australia. So that two-way exchange is really important. But the big thing is you've got to have an understanding of the market, of what you can achieve. You've got to be committed to achieving that. And often we find with companies that come up, Singapore being highly competitive, you have to be very focused on what you want to achieve during your time here. Whether you're coming up for a 1-week boot camp, whether you're coming up for a 90-day program, or whether you've got a long-term objective over a 12 to 18 month period of establishing and growing into the region, you have to stick to it, you have to be committed to it, and you have to make sure the structure of your company back in Australia and when you establish here in Singapore is structured in a way that will be able to facilitate and continue to support that. I think in general, Singapore is a very welcoming and open market. The ecosystem here is growing every day. I'm not sure if you were at our recent launch. We do a small launch for our landing pads every time they come up, every 90-day program. I think we had more than 80 people there, really enjoying connecting, building that networks, connections into Australia, connections. We had the cyber cohort there, so connecting into the cyber sector. It's really important that you come up and you connect into the ecosystem. You take all those connections seriously, even though they might not seem it in the first wash, and that you're present here. And I think if you do that, I think you can succeed.
And many thanks for coming on the show. And in closing, I would love to ask you two questions. I think the first one is, can you recommend a book or anything from movie to podcast that have recently made an impact to your life?
Okay, I did see the Avengers, the film that was very sad, the end of an era. But in regards to technology, I read a novel recently called Walk Away by Cory Doctorow, I think he's a Canadian writer, and it wasn't recommended. To be honest, we just picked it up in a bookshop, but it's really it's set in the future, but it's about how technology can make changes to your life. And how that impacts on not just business, but how social structures are formed around technology. Really, some really interesting ideas in it. Some really interesting ideas.
That's a good recommendation. And my next question is, how do my audience find you?
Well, here in Singapore, we have a website where we put up lots of information, www.austrade.gov.au/Singapore. We're also on LinkedIn. We have a big presence and we post quite a lot on LinkedIn, both myself but also Austrade as well. And they're probably the two easiest ways. However, if you're down at the Australian High Commission, you can reach out, drop me an email or via LinkedIn, and we can catch up that way as well.
And for my Australian audience, you hear it here first, so you can actually reach out and try to figure out how to expand into Singapore. You can definitely Google me at Bernard Leong. This show is co-produced by Carol In and myself. You can find us on iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, Acast, Himalaya, Spotify, and recently Luminary. Drop us any comments, feedback that you have, and most importantly, if you have any thoughts to what we want to do for the live show in September, let me know. And many thanks, Taliessin, for coming on the show, and I wish you all the success, and I hope to speak to you again.
Thank you very much. A real pleasure today.